Hi everyone, it's Tony, and I just wanted to let everybody know that our previously planned episode on Super Star Wars, which was supposed to come out this week, will unfortunately need to be delayed and will now come out next week. My sincere apologies for the shift in schedule. Instead, this week, I'll be releasing one of our previously published Patreon episodes, which was focused on the 2D modern action platformer, Terminator 2D No Fate. I hope everyone enjoys this episode, and as always, thank you very much for your support and understanding. Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today Expansion Pack, where we take an expanded look into the classic games and technology that continue to shape the gaming experiences we all know and love today. This is our Patreon exclusive podcast that's meant to build on, but not copy the traditional CGT formula. This is where we take a look at different topics and formats that might be a bit beyond the scope of CGT. We may do ranking episodes, we may do list episodes, we may look across an entire year of gaming, and occasionally we dive deeper into a modern game. And that is exactly what we're going to do today as we discuss Terminator 2D No Fate. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. As always, I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com. We have our Discord server, and of course, there is always Patreon. Feel free to reach out in any way you like. I will be there. Before we get to our topic of the day, I figured it'd be a good idea to give a little bit of a peek behind the scenes as far as what's happening around here. And the fact of the matter is, there's quite a bit going on right now, both from a podcasting perspective and a personal standpoint. But to start, I want to talk about my last weekend. So just for everybody's awareness, I am recording this episode on Monday, January 19th, bright and early, actually not so bright, but early in the morning. And this past weekend, unfortunately, my wife had to work. She had to work all weekend working on this project that she's been working on. It launches today. She had been incapacitated the entire weekend because of work. So going into the weekend, she said to me, "You know what, Tony? You're going to have to figure out a way to do stuff with the kids. Maybe you guys should just game a bunch over the weekend." And as soon as she said that, I thought to myself, oh, really? So, okay, I can do that. So anyway, putting that aside, but it was an interesting weekend because my wife usually does a lot. And she did not do a lot this weekend because she was focused solely on work. So those responsibilities that we would typically split fell to me. And I needed to figure out a way to make sure my kids were having a fun time, just myself, over the course of the weekend. And what we ended up doing was playing a bunch of games. And I've got to talk about this because this was probably one of my favorite gaming experiences and gaming weekends that I have had in a ridiculously long time. And the main reason behind that is because I got to sit with both my son and my daughter, and we played a bunch of retro games, and everybody had a great time doing it. I've got to talk about this because this is something I didn't really expect. Or I'll take that back. I had some assumptions around certain games that I thought my daughter would like. My daughter is 9. She's going to be 10 in a few months. So she's right around the cusp of being a 10-year-old. And I was thinking to myself, so I watch her play games on her iPad. She loves Roblox. She likes Minecraft. She likes those first-person kind of experiences. She likes, even in Roblox, she will play games that are based on genres that you have full-fledged game releases for on consoles or computers, or even retro-styled experiences that have just been reimagined in Roblox, like first-person shooters. She plays survival games. She plays these kind of games. And I'm thinking to myself, I mean, Roblox is Roblox. Fine, whatever. It's not bad. There are some interesting experiences out there, but Roblox is not, from my perspective, it doesn't give you the full experience of getting a full game dedicated to a specific type of content or topic. I know, based on my own gaming history, that there are tons of games out there that Roblox attempts to emulate. And I've always thought, if I could just get my daughter to try some of these games for more than, say, 15 minutes, because this is usually what happens. We sit down, and I say, hey, why don't you try this game? And she's like, okay, Dad, whatever. So she sits down, she starts playing the game. She plays it for around 15 minutes, and then she turns to me and says, can we do something else? And of course, I'm going to say yes, because I'm not going to force her to do anything that she doesn't want to do. But I've always thought that if she would just take a little bit of extra time, a little bit of more time to focus and devote and kind of get past the initial, oh, I'm playing an older game kind of feel, because for better or worse, a lot of kids today are used to modern amenities, they're used to modern graphics, and they sit down and they begin playing these older games, and they don't really get that. They don't really get the same feeling that people like us do, the older generation who lived and grew up with these games. We get that sense of nostalgia because we remember when those games came out. Kids today, they don't. And I don't mean to sound like an old guy, even though I guess I am a little bit of an old guy. But the fact is that many kids, not all, because there are certainly kids, there are kids that listen to this podcast that are playing retro games and loving every moment of it. But my kids in particular have not really been into it so much. Now, my son is still a little young. He just turned 5, actually. So he's not quite as adept at using a controller as my daughter is, mainly because he plays most of his games on his iPad as well. But anyway, we sat down and I thought to myself, I bet you, if I showed my daughter an old school first-person shooter like Quake or Doom, I bet you that she would actually really enjoy it. Here's the problem, though. I don't think my daughter wants to play a first-person shooter as a solo kind of experience. She has sat down to play some of these games before, and sometimes she gets either frightened or not really frightened, but I guess scared that she's going to be defeated by the enemies or whatever. And sometimes there are some spookier kinds of elements in some of these games. But a lot of times, I think she doesn't want to lose. And losing a lot of times in these retro games is pretty darn punishing. So I think she has a negative association with that. So she will not sit down to play a solo, single player kind of retro experience. But I thought to myself, well, wait a second. We have pretty much all of the Night Dive remasters of all of the classic first-person shooters over the last few years that have been coming out by Night Dive. We talked about Night Dive Studios during our year in review episode, and I talked about how much I love the work that Night Dive is doing, bringing these modernized versions of retro classics back into the popular spotlight, or at least into somewhat of a spotlight, and giving gamers of all ages opportunities to enjoy these titles once again, oftentimes with modern amenities. And I started scrolling through my game list, and I thought to myself, well, wait a second, what about Quake? I wonder if she would enjoy playing Quake, because Quake, when you include the modernized controls on a controller, feels kind of like a modern first-person shooter would. Now, granted, it's still a retro-styled classic kind of experience, but the Night Dive remaster makes things a little bit more modern. And I thought to myself, well, wait a second, that also has local co-op. We could do a split-screen co-op kind of experience. We could play through the Quake campaign with the two of us at the same time, sitting next to each other, me making jokes or trying to save her from bad guys and her just enjoying the whole experience. I thought this was a match made in heaven. So I mentioned to her, I said, hey, would you like to play Quake? And at first she was like, I don't know, maybe. And then she's like, okay, sure. I'll try it out. So we start playing the game. And her first immediate reaction was, this is not, I mean, it's okay. She kind of, I feel like she kind of tries to spare my feelings sometimes, like, even though I didn't create the game, but I think sometimes she's kind of like, oh yeah, it's fun. Yeah, Dad, yeah, it's a fun experience. And sometimes I can tell that she's not really feeling it. It's one of those things where, just like some of the other experiences that I have shown her, she's kind of, after 15 minutes, she says, okay, yeah, this was great. Can I try something else now? So we were playing Quake together, and she didn't really know all the controls. She started to get used to it. It was very fast, as anybody who's played Quake knows. It's very fast gameplay. There's a lot of different enemies. There's different enemies that have different attacks. You have the grenade guys that have the chainsaws. You have the shamblers with their lightning attacks. You have the general marines. You have the fiends that leap out of nowhere and try to eviscerate you. There's so many different enemies that you have to deal with, and a lot of times the gameplay is pretty darn fast. She was not used to that style of gameplay. So at the very beginning of our experience, she was kind of like, I don't know. She was a little bit on the fence, I could tell. But then after a couple levels, I started to see her get kind of engaged in the game. I saw a dramatic shift in the way she was playing. She started leaning forward a little bit more, looking at the TV screen. She started to get a little bit more familiar with the controls, and she started to actively enjoy the experience of playing Quake. So then after around 4 or 5 levels, I turned to her and I said, well, hey, what do you think? And she kind of gave me this smirk. And I don't know if all kids have this ability to just give you this smirk that's like, oh my God, Dad, really? She does. But anyway, so I asked her how she was liking the game, and she said, it's actually kind of fun. And I thought, yes, it's kind of fun. I will take it. So we continued playing it, and it turns out my daughter actually really enjoyed Quake. So much so that we completed the entire 4-episode campaign over the course of the last day and a half. Yes, I think she had gotten that gene from my wife, who, when she finds a game that she likes, she will play that game and play that game and play that game. Well, I think my daughter is the same exact way, because Quake was one of those games that she absolutely really, really liked, and I had a blast playing it with her. Now, the first time through the game, we did play it on easy because I wanted to introduce her to the overall experience and the controls, and I didn't want to create a very difficult kind of experience. After we beat the game on easy, I'm thinking to myself, well, I can't wait to show her other games. And then she turned to me because I'd said, hey, do you want to play another game now? And she said, well, we didn't fully beat Quake yet. And I said, what? What do you mean? We completed the 4 episodes. I mean, sure, the modern remaster has a bunch of different campaigns that we could do. They have the DLC packs. They have the packs that are created specifically for Quake. And I said, well, what do you mean? We beat Quake. And she said, we only beat easy. And my first thought was, I am so proud of you right now, because I expected her to beat easy and then say, okay, well, we're done with Quake. That was a fun game. Let's go play something else. But she said, no, I want to beat it now on normal and hard. And in the back of my head, I'm thinking, I don't know that you're ready for this. Just knowing, because I played through Quake for a prior episode of the podcast early on. And what was it, like episode 18, 19, somewhere around there? I remember, and this granted was the original experience, but I knew that Quake Beyond Easy got pretty darn challenging, especially if you go beyond normal. I played the game on normal back when I did that episode, and I found the game to be really enjoyable. The thing is, though, there's a difference between co-op and local playing of the game. First of all, in co-op, you cannot save your game, which is an interesting design decision. I will say something I'm not sure I fully appreciated is the fact that you can't actually save your game and doesn't actually save your campaign progress. You basically just play the levels in sequence, and you kind of have to, if you get out of the game, you have to just go back to the level that you were in, and it doesn't keep the overall campaign progress. So I do have a little bit of a critique there with how that co-op gameplay actually worked. But beyond that, I know that just by virtue of playing through co-op, if you die, you just pop back up, you respawn, you go back into the battle, and you continue playing. We used that to great effect, because it wasn't like we breezed through the campaign and didn't lose any lives. No, we died plenty of times. There were plenty of times where my daughter got overwhelmed, or I died because I was trying to save her, and I jumped into the middle of battle that I probably shouldn't have, and then I ended up dying and having to respawn and get back over there. But it was a ton of fun playing on a co-op. When you go into normal or even harder difficulties, the number of times that you're going to die will increase. And the way the Quake difficulty works in general is between easy, normal, and hard, you have different amounts of monsters that populate each level. On easy, just as a hypothetical example, you might have 20 monsters in a given level. On normal, you might have 45 monsters, and on hard you might have 70. So it's not like the overall monsters change dramatically, the gameplay from that perspective, but the number increases. And then of course, if you go to nightmare difficulty, that's where things completely go off the rails. You get all the monsters from hard, and they also move dramatically faster. So that's the way difficulty works in Quake. And I thought to myself, I don't think this is going to be the thing for you, but let's do it anyway. So we sat down and we started playing through normal, and we got through the first 3 or 4 levels of the game of the first episode, and things were going fine. And she turned to me and she said, "Normal's easy. This is not that bad." And then we got up to, I think it was the 5th episode or the 5th map in the first episode. And that was where things started to get a little bit trickier. There were enemies. There were a lot more enemies. There were a lot more fiends. There were multiple shamblers. There were all sorts of things going on. She died a bunch in that level. Now, granted, we had gotten a little bit complacent and we had started to explore levels independently to try to solve the levels quicker. So I would go off in one direction. She would go off in another. As I'm dealing with enemies over on the right-hand side of the map, she might be dealing with enemies on the left-hand side of the map. In retrospect, that was the wrong decision. We should have stuck together because it would have made the experience, I think, a lot more smooth than what it ended up being. But she would get overwhelmed sometimes with the enemies. She got a little upset. She was like, "Oh man, I'm not feeling this right now." And I said, "Okay, all right, let's take a step back. And when we come back to it, if you want to keep playing it later on or another time, whatever, we'll make sure that we're going through the levels together so that we're not having this kind of experience." So she said, "Okay, Dad, that sounds great." So we put Quake aside, we turned it off, and then I was kind of like, I really want her to try Doom. I felt like I wanted to strike while the iron was hot, and I really wanted her to try Doom. So I said, "Hey," this was later on in the day. I said, "Hey, do you want to play another game?" And she said, "Yeah, that sounds great." And I said, "Do you want to try Doom? It's kind of like Quake. It's a little bit older, but it's modern, and they modernized it a bit, and I think you would really like it." And she kind of gave me the same kind of look that she did when I first had suggested Quake. She was like, "Whatever. Okay, Dad, fine. Let's go try it out." So we got down to the TV, went over, we started playing Doom. And at first she's like, "Oh, these controls are different," because there is no mouse look kind of thing in Doom. It's just the normal horizontal plane. The vertical looking just didn't exist, and it does not exist in the remaster. So we're playing Doom, and the first level, she's kind of like, "Oh, okay." And then the second level, and I forgot to mention this about Quake. This is going to come into play with Doom. As she got more proficient with Quake, she started to just breeze through levels. Like, she was timid at first. When she first started playing Quake, she was sticking in the back and kind of staying back while I would go off and deal with some of the enemies up front and all that kind of stuff. But no, by around the second episode, midway through the second episode of Quake, she was running ahead of me, jumping around platforms, killing enemies left and right. And I was just like, wow, you are a different person than when we first started playing the game. It was really cool to see. So anyway, we start playing Doom, and she took that same gameplay over to Doom. So she is breezing through these levels. She's running around. She grabs a shotgun. She grabs a minigun. She just starts firing enemies left and right. And I'm like, wow, you are like a little mini 10-year-old Terminator over here, just going around everywhere. And it was great to see. It was fun. She actually had a lot of fun playing Doom. And I had mentioned to her, I said, there's also deathmatch here. And she said, "Well, what's that?" I said, "Well, you know how sometimes you play on Roblox and you have these competitive games and you play against other people? Well, it's the same kind of thing. You could play against me." And she was like, "Oh, that might be fun. That sounds like it could be fun, Dad." And she wanted to play it. So I said, "Okay, let's give deathmatch a go." And I told her up front, I said, "Listen, how do you want to handle this? Do you want me to play you as though I'm playing my daughter? Or do you want me to play you like I'm playing somebody on the internet?" And she said, "No, just play like you're playing against her daughter to start." I said, "Okay, cool." So I'm going around, I'm kind of moving around the levels slowly and all that kind of stuff. I'm picking up some weapons. I'm firing at her, but I'm intentionally not trying to be the normal obnoxious self that I am when I play against internet strangers, because she's my daughter. I'm not going to do that. So I'm kind of letting her get some shots in. I'm moving around a little bit slower. And then at one point she says, "Okay, Dad, now try to play me like you play against somebody from the internet." And I said, "Are you sure?" She said, Yes, I want to try it." I said, "Okay, now I'm warning you, this is going to be different. She said, okay, I'm ready. So then I proceeded to play against my daughter the way I would play against somebody from the internet, which meant moving around erratically as fast as I humanly could, spinning around trying to shoot her as much as possible before she can get any shots in on me. It was a very different experience, but you know what? It was actually incredibly fun, and she had a great time doing it too, because every now and then she would whittle my life down enough to beat me, to kill me, and then she'd be like, oh my God, I got you, Dad. And I would always react like over the top, because that's just the way I try to get the laughs out of her. So I was like, oh my God, I can't believe you got me. Where were you? Kind of thing. And she had a blast doing that. So we played some more Doom Deathmatch for a little bit before we turned it off and called it a weekend, so to speak, because we played a ton. I mean, we played literally a good chunk of the day Saturday, a good chunk of the day Sunday, and I had a blast. I think she had a blast too. And then my son was, after we had played a bit, and he hasn't shown as much interest in console games, but he turned to me and he said that it's his turn now. I said, okay, buddy, well, what do you want to play? And he wanted to play Burnout Paradise. Now, I had installed Burnout Paradise maybe a week ago, and I was going through the remastered version because I wanted to play Burnout Paradise. I remember having a lot of fun with that game back when I was younger, and I thought, well, why not? Give it a go. And I was giving it a go. And apparently my son wanted to give it a go too. So he sits down. I give him the controller, get past the intro, and I say, okay, all right, drive. You can drive, you can do whatever you want. And I just kind of sat off to the side. And you know what? He was driving around that city with the biggest smile on his face that I may have seen in a very long time. He had such a great time just driving around in Burnout Paradise. He didn't really do any of the races, but he would smash through the different barriers. He'd try to get the billboards. He'd drive around in traffic. He'd wreck his car, but there's really no ramifications to doing that because Burnout Paradise is just an arcade racing game that just is simply awesome to experience. He had a great time playing that one too. He drove for maybe 20-ish miles before he kind of said, okay, I'm done. In which case I said, okay, buddy. So I shut down the system. That was the end of our gaming for the weekend. But I've got to say, this past weekend was so much fun. I had such a great time playing these games with my daughter and with my son. It was amazing. I felt bad for my wife because she was stuck working all weekend. But the fact is, we had a great time. It was not the weekend that I expected going into it, but I think it was the weekend that we needed. And it was a ton of fun. I had an absolute blast. Anyway, moving past the personal weekend kind of stuff, I remain focused, as always, on getting all of our podcast episodes out there and continuing to maintain my backlog. We're pretty much spot on from a backlog perspective. I have 10-ish or so episodes in my back pocket ready to go that are fully recorded, ready to release, which I think is a nice buffer because work is going to be very, very busy coming up over the course of the next couple months in particular, and then beyond that, who the heck knows? But certainly over the next couple months, there's a ton of workshops coming up. Even next week, there's going to be an all-week workshop that I'm going to be at that is going to just divert my attention entirely. There's more of those workshops that are going to be coming up after the fact. There's going to be program milestones and different things that have to happen in order to make this whole project I've been working on a reality over the course of the next couple of years. So I'm just trying to stay up to date and actually ahead of the game wherever I can, as well as getting some good playtime in whenever I can. So that's kind of what's going on here. Oh, it also snowed this weekend, by the way, which the snow was irritating. It was an irritating snow. I don't mind the snow. I mind shoveling the snow. And I had to shovel the snow twice this weekend. I'm going to have to shovel it again this morning because more fell overnight. Now, we don't usually get a ton of snow here, or at least recently we haven't gotten a ton of snow. And it's not like each of the storms that hit us this weekend dropped a huge amount of snow. They each dropped between maybe 3 to 4 inches, but that's 3 to 4 inches multiple times. That can add up a little bit. So I did shovel the driveway twice this past weekend. I'm going to have to shovel it again this morning because another inch or so fell overnight. And I've just got to say, if it's not Christmas, I don't need the snow. Give me one day out of the year where I get snow and I'd be happy. You wake up to a white Christmas and I am good. Any other day of the year, I'd rather it be sunny. I don't need the snow, but we did have fun. My son and daughter and I all went out in the snow over the course of the weekend. We built some snowmen. We had some fun doing that. So it was a good weekend. This was a perfect family weekend. And I've got to say, this weekend recharged me more so than the 2 weeks off during the holidays, because even though I took 2 weeks off during the holidays, there was still work stuff that happened here and there. There was just other stuff. There was broader planning for all of the holiday stuff and getting everything arranged and just logistics and adult stuff that kids don't really need to worry about. This past weekend, after the last 2 days of just literally just vegging out and playing with my kids, it felt good. And now I'm as ready as I can possibly be going into the work week, which I've got to say, I'm not a fan of Mondays. Oh, I'm really not. And unfortunately, my company does not shut down for Martin Luther King Jr. Day. My wife's company does, but she has to work anyway because of this big project that she's working on. There's a whole mess of stuff happening. Anyway, that's enough behind the scenes for today. I've rambled on for way longer than what I probably should have. So let's turn our attention to the topic of the day, which is Terminator 2D No Fate. So let's talk about this. And we're going to do some history and we're going to do some review. It's going to be fairly similar to most of our traditional episodes, but I do want to talk a little bit about why I chose Terminator 2D No Fate to even play. And this is something that happened back mid-December because that's actually when this game came out. This is almost as modern of a game as we've covered on an expansion pack episode because Terminator 2D No Fate came out literally just a month and 4 days ago at the point of this recording. So it is a very new game, but it mimics a very old game. And we're going to talk about all that in just a little bit. So around mid-December, I had been following a little bit the progress of Terminator 2D No Fate. For anybody who doesn't know what this is a 16-bit styled release that basically takes T2 Judgment Day, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, the movie, and creates a licensed title focused on Terminator 2. It's a modern release, but it is designed as a 16-bit experience. And we'll talk about the prior Terminator experiences that have come out on video game consoles and computers. But the fact of the matter is, Terminator games have not really always been that great. In fact, we've talked about some that have really not been that great on prior episodes of the podcast. But I'd been following a little bit the development behind Terminator 2D, and it looked really cool. It was getting some nice early buzz. It was kind of being thought of as a true representation of Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And it was done with all of the modern amenities you might expect, but still retro styled. And I thought to myself, this might be perfect. I haven't played a side-scrolling run-and-gun kind of shooter because that's what this is. It's basically a side-scrolling run-and-gun kind of shooter mixed in with some other gameplay that we'll talk about as we go through the game. But it's this two-dimensional, almost Contra-like 2D side-scrolling shooter. But basically recreating the story of Terminator 2 and adding to it in some capacities, which once again, we will talk about. And I thought to myself, this sounds absolutely amazing. So I did purchase it. I purchased it when it came out on December 15th in 2025, and I sat down to play it. And it turns out I kept playing it and playing it and playing it again. I became very addicted to Terminator 2D No Fate, which, considering that a full playthrough takes only 30 to 45 minutes, you might be wondering, how the heck could you be playing that game over and over and over again? Why would you do that? I will explain why later on. But the fact is, Terminator 2D No Fate really gripped me. And as I was playing through the game for the umpteenth time, I realized that this was a game that needed more attention. I don't remember seeing much, and I can't remember this. There might have been a couple posts out on Discord about it, but I really don't remember there being all that much discussion about it. And I thought that is something we need to address, which is why today we're going to dive deep into Terminator 2D No Fate. Terminator 2D No Fate is a side-scrolling action platforming title developed by Bitmap Bureau and published by Reef Entertainment for all modern platforms as of December 12th, 2025. Oh, December 12th. Damn it. I messed up. Earlier I was saying December 15th. It was actually December 12th. Oh well, I guess sometimes you make a mistake. But anyway, so Terminator 2D No Fate came out just around a month ago, a little bit over a month ago as of this recording. And before we get into that game, before we talk about what makes that game special, I want to give a little bit of a history about Terminator itself. Now, we have talked about Terminator a few times before on the podcast. We had an episode devoted to a bunch of different 16-bit titles related to the original Terminator film. During that episode, which was the longest episode at the point of its release, which has since been eclipsed several times over by some of our other more modern episodes, or more recent episodes, I should say. But that first episode on Terminator focused on the Terminator for the Sega Genesis, Terminator for the Super Nintendo, and Terminator for the Sega CD. And at the time, we went through and reviewed each of those individual games, with the only one that I could affirmatively say being a true good experience being Terminator on the Sega CD. I love that game, even though it didn't hit the Pantheon. I had always loved that game. I loved the fact that there were FMV sequences included in between the different missions. I thought the run and gun action included in that game felt awesome to experience. That was the kind of game that back when I was younger, I played through it over and over and over again. Not because I was trying to unlock new gameplay modes or anything like that. I just liked the game, and it became kind of like a comfort food for me. I would play Terminator on the Sega CD repeatedly, and anytime I had some extra time to spare, if I felt like playing a futuristic sci-fi shooting kind of experience, Terminator was going to be one of the games that I would select from because I just loved playing Terminator on the Sega CD. It was one of those kind of experiences that back when I was younger, I would just play for the heck of it. Now, most recently, I haven't really been doing a lot of that. There's not a lot of times where I look at games that I've played and think, oh, I want to go back and play that one again. Just because there's so many games to play. There are so many different games to experience, and there's not enough time in the day to experience everything. So oftentimes I will play a game, I'll enjoy it, but then I'll move on to something else, and I won't really revisit that game, maybe years later, but it's not something where I'll replay it over and over and over again. Back when I was younger, I would do that a lot more, but today, not so much. Anyway, I mention all of that because it's going to become something to discuss as we keep talking about Terminator 2D No Fate. The fact or the act of playing a game over and over and over again and enjoying yourself each time you play it. That's something that I haven't been doing a lot in recent history, but it will come into play later on in our story. Anyway, for anybody who doesn't know about Terminator, the Terminator was originally a sci-fi film released in the earlier 80s that tells a story about a cybernetic being that gets sent back from the future to defeat, to kill a woman who will eventually give birth to what would effectively be the savior of humanity, or potential savior of humanity in the future. Because the Terminator, as a film and as a franchise, is all about the perils and pitfalls of artificial intelligence, which ironically is something we're all dealing with today. We're dealing with AI a lot today and how that could potentially impact all of our lives, both positively and potentially negatively. Well, the Terminator, released in the early 80s, was kind of a little bit of a predictor of the kinds of things that AI might eventually do. And I've got to say, AI is becoming a little bit too all-knowing for me at this point in time. It's really cool technology, but it's kind of interesting to look at some of the parallels between the AI hellscape that the Terminator franchise presents and the potential AI hellscape that's happening in modern times. Anyway, Terminator, all about AI, all about this cybernetic being that gets sent back to kill the mother of humanity, effectively, and hopefully prevent the human race from surviving in the future. Of course, the Resistance in the future needs to send somebody else back to protect that individual. The woman's name is Sarah Connor, just in case anybody wasn't aware. So John Connor, who is her eventual son in the future, sends back another man, Kyle Reese, into the past to protect Sarah Connor from this cybernetic organism. A lot of stuff happens I'm not going to spoil anything just in case you haven't seen the film, but a lot of stuff happens, and suffice it to say, it is a sci-fi masterpiece for a reason. The Terminator is an amazing film, and actually, as I was going through my recent bout with Terminator fanboydom, or whatever you want to call it, I did go back and I watched The Terminator because I was in that Terminator mood after playing Terminator 2D No Fate. I actually went back and watched T2 Judgment Day as well as part of this overall deeper dive into Terminator stuff. And then I stopped because there are no films past T2, right? There's nothing Terminator related past T2. That was the end point in the whole thing, right? I know in reality that's not the case, but in my headcanon, that is where the story effectively ends, because everything past T2 from my perspective, and in all fairness, I haven't seen every single film. I didn't really watch the Sarah Connor Chronicles on television, so maybe stuff gets better. But from the stuff that I have seen past T2, I'm not as big of a fan from the films that I've seen beyond that. So for me, Terminator and T2, awesome experiences. Anyway, moving past the films, there had always been an attempt, or not always, but there were attempts at trying to bring that Terminator franchise into the home in an interactive kind of experience. We talked about some of them during our episode on Terminator before, where we talked about the 16-bit versions for the Sega Genesis, the Sega CD, and the Super Nintendo, like I mentioned a little bit earlier. There were other efforts to bring Terminator to the masses from an interactive perspective. There were releases on the computer. There were also games based on T2 Judgment Day, which we didn't really talk all that much about before. There were T2 games that were released on the Super Nintendo, or at least a T2 game that was released on the Super Nintendo. There was the Terminator 2 light gun game released in the arcades. Now, I will admit that I don't have nearly as much experience with T2 based games as I do with games based on the original film. But you know what? It sounds like I might have dodged a bullet, because 16-bit console games based on Terminator 2 have, for the most part, not been treated all that kindly by critics. And I've actually captured some quotes from critics about Terminator 2 on the Super Nintendo. This was a game, by the way, that I did play in my past, but it was really only a single weekend rental. I went to Blockbuster Video, I rented the game, I played the game, and I never went back to the game. I don't recall thinking much about my experience with the game. I don't recall if I liked it, didn't like it. I probably thought it was kind of just like a game. It was a game. It was there. And I'm a happy guy in general. I don't really have a ton of critical kinds of feedback a lot of times. If a game plays and it kind of plays okay-ish enough, I'm usually pretty happy. And that was even more so when I was younger, where I really didn't critique much of anything. So honestly, if the game booted up, I probably thought, it's a T2 game. It's not so bad. But I will tell you that critical response to Terminator 2 on the Super Nintendo was much less kind. So here are some quotes from critics that focused on Terminator 2 for both the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. And I don't have the specific game that they're talking about for each of these quotes. They kind of apply to both equally. First quote, massive disappointment. Second quote, a film license game of the very worst, most despicable sort. Next quote. You'll be hard-pressed to find a more inept game than this. It's absolute trash, and Acclaim should be ashamed that they're actually releasing it. Another quote. An outright disaster for Acclaim, who ought to bin this title before anyone notices it exists. And there were other individuals who claimed that the Super Nintendo version of Terminator 2 was probably the worst licensed Super NES game of all time. Definitely some harsh critique. But there were some successful T2 experiences from back around the time that the film came out, like the previously mentioned T2 the arcade game, which I had a lot of fun playing in the arcades using the light gun that was included with that experience, and the computer version of Terminator 2 as published by Ocean Software, which apparently was not all that bad. Although I will say that the quality of the computer version appears to have wildly inconsistent reviews, with some publications giving it a 90 plus on a 100-point scale, while others rating it as low as 14%. I haven't personally played that one, so I can't say one way or the other, but overall, I think it's safe to say that the T2 film license, very similar to the original Terminator film license, did not transition over to the world of video games with any degree of universal competence. That being said, there are countless individuals who loved the film and wished that there had been a game created to really make you feel like you were starring in your own T2-themed adventure. It's just that for over 30 years, nobody had really cracked the code. That is, until the team at Bitmap Bureau decided to make their own homage to T2, complete with a 16-bit style and retro-oriented gameplay designed to basically say, this is what could have been if developers in the 90s had put some effort behind their attempts at creating a T2 game, as opposed to looking at the license as a mere cash grab. This goal of creating a worthwhile T2 experience is what would lead Bitmap Bureau to create our game of the day, Terminator 2D, No Fate. Now, before we talk specifically about T2 No Fate, it's probably a good idea to talk a little bit about the company behind the game, Bitmap Bureau, which is a UK-based development studio that might not be all that well known, unless you've been following modern, albeit retro, 16-bit game releases over the last few years. What makes Bitmap Bureau special in comparison to other developers creating 16-bit styled titles is that Bitmap Bureau isn't just making games that are reminiscent of 16-bit games. They are making actual, real 16-bit games that can run on both modern hardware and authentic 16-bit consoles from 30 years ago. The curious amongst you might be wondering how the heck this is possible, because, for better or worse, we've all been conditioned to assume that any 16-bit or similar styled retro game today is designed to play like we remember 16-bit titles playing, but with all sorts of modern amenities, as opposed to truly reflecting the way 16-bit hardware actually played these older games, which, more times than not, had a number of restrictions that software developers needed to adhere to in order to make a playable game that could perform well on the relatively underpowered hardware of the 16-bit era, especially in comparison to even the lowliest of hardware available today. What this means is that 16-bit styled titles today might look the part, but are oftentimes truly modern experiences, and could never run on the now aged hardware that once graced our collective living rooms and dens. Which is why the work that Bitmap Bureau is doing is so unique. Not only are they creating games that play on modern computers and home consoles, but those games are subsequently ported to 30-plus-year-old 16-bit systems like the Neo Geo, Super NES, and Sega Genesis. With some concessions, sure, but oftentimes, the experience you get on those real consoles is pretty equivalent to the experience you'd get on a modern console like the PS5 or Nintendo Switch. The graphics might need to be tweaked a bit to a lower resolution, and the sound quality might need to be reduced to fit on the cartridges that those systems utilized. But for all intents and purposes, Bitmap Bureau ports are faithful to the more modern equivalents of their games, in essence making Bitmap Bureau a modern developer of new retro games. The trick to making all of this work lies in what the company calls its abstraction engine, a piece of technology that serves as the foundation for their games and uses some clever coding tricks to effectively allow ports to a number of different classic consoles without needing to write the software from scratch in esoteric assembly language. The team at Bitmap Bureau has figured out a way to port the underlying game code for their titles from one platform to the next fairly seamlessly, with most of the effort for any given port going into shrinking down the graphics and audio to fit within the constraints of their target console platform, as opposed to needing to code things from scratch. I will admit that I don't know all of the software development tricks the team uses to make this happen, but regardless, I am impressed at the end result. Anyway, back to Terminator 2D No Fate. The team at Bitmap Bureau had been longtime fans of the Terminator franchise, and they, like many, felt that there had never been an honest-to-goodness quality game based on the T2 license. So they took it upon themselves to create an arcade-styled action platform experience that they hoped would truly embody the feeling of the film, complete with all of the main story beats from the movie included, a number of alternate history-branching paths, 4 different difficulties to challenge interested gamers, a variety of levels that mixed traditional Contra-styled run-and-gun shooting with beat-em-up stages and vehicle-based sequences, and a number of cutscenes that would help to tell the overall plot as gamers would progress through the game. The end result of this effort was the creation of Terminator 2D No Fate, a game that just released a little over a month ago, and would very quickly earn its spot as one of, if not the, best game based on the Terminator license. Critics and gamers have flocked to the title, with some adding it as a late entry to their best games of 2025 lists, and countless others believing the game to have been a long-lost relic of a title that they somehow had never heard of until now. That, of course, isn't the case. It's just that Bitmap Bureau seems to be really good at making actual modern 16-bit titles, so much so that a number of people continue to be fooled into thinking this game had to have come out 30 years ago, when in reality, it's less than 2 months old. Certainly impressive work by the team, both from a modern and retro perspective. Terminator 2D No Fate would release on modern computer and console platforms on December 12th, 2025, with a press release indicating that specific ports to retro consoles will be announced at a later date. I'll admit, I am super curious to see what those retro ports will look like and how they'll play, because I spent a pretty sizable chunk of time playing Terminator 2D on my Sony PS5, and if Bitmap Bureau is able to recreate that experience on, say, the Super Nintendo, I may need to actually buy the eventual cartridge for the game, because that would be truly impressive. Anyway, current discourse around the game suggests that it is a worthwhile title, especially for fans of the Terminator franchise, which I am, so I was super curious to begin playing this one. My question was, would Terminator 2D No Fate truly create a worthwhile Terminator 2 gaming experience, or would it fail to capture the magic of the film, despite the best efforts of a modern development studio that is obviously very talented? We'll talk through the answer to that question in just a couple minutes, as we continue our deep dive into Terminator 2D No Fate. As we begin diving deeper into what it feels like to play Terminator 2D No Fate, I figured it would probably be a good idea to go over the general structure of the game. So, like I've mentioned a couple times at this point, Terminator 2D No Fate is a side-scrolling action platformer kind of experience, very similar in many ways to games like Contra, where you're constantly moving from left to right, and you're shooting a bunch of different enemies while hopefully avoiding taking damage yourself, because taking damage in these games is oftentimes deadly, and it is certainly deadly in Terminator 2D No Fate. So let's talk about the overall structure of the game. Basically, the main gist of the overall experience is to create an arcade-centric action platforming experience. And to do that, as with many games of this type, you're going to have multiple different modes that you'll be able to play through, with the biggest, most focused area being the arcade mode or campaign mode kind of experience, where you will go through, you'll pick a difficulty of 1 of 4, and we'll talk about the different difficulties in a little bit, but you'll pick a difficulty and then you will play through the entirety of the game, controlling different characters along the way, and progressing through the entire story of Terminator 2 Judgment Day. Each level within the game, and there are a bunch of different levels included in the game. There's actually probably 15-ish or so, but you're not going to see all 15 levels in a single playthrough, and I'll explain why a little bit later. But you have around 15 levels included in the game. And for the most part, they all follow a very similar kind of structure. You'll start by playing either John Connor, Sarah Connor, or at least on a couple occasions, the actual T-800, the Arnold Schwarzenegger character from the Terminator film. So you do get to control him a couple times. But most of the time you're playing the game, you're controlling either John Connor or Sarah Connor. And you will move through each individual level. You'll have to fight a bunch of bad guys. You have different weapons that you'll be able to experience. Not a ton of different weapons in this game. You have a pistol, which by the way feels really good to use. The pistol is most often used by Sarah Connor earlier in the game. You also have a machine gun of sorts that you'll be able to use in different levels, and you do have different power-ups that you can apply to those weapons, which effectively gives you a very limited amount of time of a certain power-up. Things like a homing shot, which as the name would suggest, homes in on an individual enemy without you having to aim at them. You also get a spread shot, similar to the Contra spread shot, but not nearly as powerful from my perspective. And you also get a laser beam that you can fire at certain points, which is pretty darn powerful and lets your shots pass through obstacles, which means you might be able to be on a bottom platform, shoot up through the top platform, and attack enemies without them being able to attack you, which is pretty darn cool. So you progress through these levels, and you will, as you continue to go through each of the levels, you'll experience a variety of different enemies and also a variety of different bosses and mini-bosses. And sometimes those bosses and even the enemies included within the level themselves can be pretty challenging. Luckily, there is a continue system included within the game, which means you can continue if you end up dying. You can take a few hits per level, and the amount of hit points that you have in each level can vary, and they will vary based on your difficulty as well as which character you actually play through the game as. And it's not like you can pick the character per level. It's not that kind of game. You don't pick from either Sarah Connor, John Connor, or the Terminator, but in each individual level, you'll have different hit points assigned. So you might imagine if you're playing a level as the Terminator, your hit points are going to be dramatically more than what you would have if you're playing, say, Sarah Connor in a given level. Anyway, there is a continue system built into the game. The number of continues that you get varies based on the difficulty, and on easy difficulty, you actually don't have to worry about continues. There are infinite continues in easy. All of the other game modes have differing values for your number of continues that you start with and the number of continues that you will acquire. Actually, the number of continues you can acquire, because there is an extra continue hidden in each level, that number is the same. You will always be able to acquire those continues regardless of what difficulty you play on, but the number of continues you start the experience with will differ based on the difficulty that you choose. Anyway, moving through the game, there are different types of levels that you'll experience as you play the game. This is not the example of just a straight run and gun kind of shooter. There are certainly a bunch of levels that are focused on run and gun shooting, but there are also levels focused on more of a beat 'em up kind of experience. And there's one level focused on the beat 'em up kind of experience, which if anybody has played or actually watched Terminator 2, you will recall the scene early in the film where Arnold Schwarzenegger goes into a biker bar and he needs some clothes and he needs a motorcycle and he kind of beats people up inside. Well, that level or that scene is perfectly recreated in a level in the game where you have to play a little bit of a beat 'em up styled experience where you control the Terminator and you got to beat up a bunch of bikers. It's actually pretty darn cool. I will say, though, if I'm being critical about it, the beat 'em up action here is fairly limited. It's certainly not the focus of the game, so it is not going to feel the same as playing a true beat 'em up styled experience like Streets of Rage or Final Fight or any game where the beat 'em up portion of the experience is focused on. Anyway, it's still a cool level, and thematically, especially when you look at side by side the film with the game, it's really cool the level of detail that's included within the game. And actually, that's going to be a common piece of feedback throughout this entire discussion. The degree to which Terminator 2D No Fate reflects the film and captures even the tiniest of details, like even the way a sign looks in a bar or just the overall layout, the way they capture all of this, both in the characters as well as the environmental details, is amazing to see. It is a true love letter to Terminator 2, and it is really cool to experience. Moving past the run and gun levels, which are the majority of the game, as well as the beat 'em up level, which there's one of, there are also a couple of levels where you'll be in vehicles. And one of the levels is based on the motorcycle truck kind of experience or a motorcycle truck chase that happened in T2, where you have to try to avoid a truck as you're riding around on your motorcycle. And then later on, there's another level where you'll be in more of an armored transport, and you'll be trying to get away from a helicopter, which is controlled by the T-1000, which of course is the bad guy Terminator in this particular game. So there are several different levels that you'll experience. Most of them are run and gun, but there is some variety sprinkled in there for good measure, which is really cool to see. And as you play the game more and more, you will appreciate the variety. Though I will say the run and gun experience is pretty darn addicting by itself. As you play through the game, you'll notice that each level will have some sort of time limit, at least if you're playing on anything other than the easiest difficulty setting, because the easy mode, much like the rest of the discussion that we've had so far around continues and just the overall level density, which we really didn't talk about yet, but easy mode is truly easy. The number of enemies you face is reduced. The speed with which enemies react is minimized. You have unlimited continues. You have unlimited time to move through each level. You don't have to worry about anything on easy mode. Easy mode is accessible to pretty much anybody that might have any proficiency with gaming at all. And even if you don't have proficiency with gaming, you will be able to get through easy mode because you have unlimited continues. And I've often said, if you have unlimited continues, you will be able to beat whatever game you're trying. It's just going to take some time. Any other difficulty mode, you have to worry about actually preserving your life and maximizing the number of continues you find and really learning the different behaviors of enemies, which do get more complex as you move into different difficulty settings. Now, one of the core frameworks, or one of the core pieces of the framework for the game, is the fact that as you beat different levels, you will be ranked in that level. And it's a very traditional ranking system where you might get ranked anywhere from an A, a B, an S kind of thing. Very similar to level rankings or just ranking systems you'd see in any number of retro-styled experiences or even modern games today. That is all based on your overall score that you get for the level, the speed with which you move through the level, and a number of other factors that I'm honestly not entirely sure of because the game doesn't really tell you. I mean, it gives you a breakdown of your score at the end of each level, but it's not entirely clear what makes up that score, because I will say that there were some levels as I was going through trying to S-rank everything that I played from my perspective pretty much perfectly. I literally at one point no hit a level, meaning I didn't get hit at all. I moved through about as optimally as I could. I didn't get hit. I took no damage. I killed everything in my path. I maximized my overall score multiplier because as you get consecutive kills, you'll actually increase your score multiplier, which will increase your score even more. You get like a ×2, ×3, ×4. I think the max might be around a ×10 or something. I know I got at least a ×10 at one point. So there was one time I went through an entire level and I didn't take any damage. I killed everything in my path. I had the maximum score I thought I could possibly get, and I still only got an A rank, which just boggled my mind, and I was really irritated with that one. But I did not S rank that for some reason. So there's got to be some hidden stuff going into the overall level rankings. Regardless, it is cool to be able to get those level rankings because it kind of tells you how well you're playing the game and also gives you something to strive for if you decide to repeatedly play the game, which, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, I did end up doing. Anyway, moving past the general structure of the game does include multiple game modes. The first is the story mode, which is kind of what we've been talking about. That's kind of the main arcade campaign mode in the game, where you progress through the Terminator 2 story. Although, I will say that there are certain parts of the story where there are some branches. I mentioned earlier that the whole game has 15 levels, and when you first play through the game, you probably experience around between 8 to 12-ish of the levels. Now I'm trying to remember, and my memory is a little foggy at the moment, but you'll experience a subset of the levels when you first play through the game. You have to play through the game a few different times and actually play through different game modes in order to unlock alternate branches through that story. And really, there are only two choice points. There are 2 points in playing through the story that you have a choice to go one direction versus another. And as you might imagine, that means that you can create multiple branches through the story, and the story will shift depending on which branches you take. Now, the story here is told in very traditional cutscene style. It is effective at telling the story, especially if you have no clue about what's going on with Terminator 2. Like if you've never seen the film, you'll actually be able to get a pretty good feeling of what's happening just by watching the cutscenes in between each level. Not going to get the full picture, but you'll get enough to really give you some impetus to go forward and continue to play the platforming action that you'll have in the game. But I did appreciate the fact that there were alternate branches through the story. There are 3 different paths in all, and in order to see every single level that exists in the game, you do have to play every single alternate branch, which I thought was awesome. You also have an arcade mode. So actually, I should take a step back. I had been mentioning the arcade mode as kind of the default campaign in the game. I'm entirely false, and my notes have proven it to me that I've just been talking a little bit more off the cuff than what I should have. There is a story mode, which is the main campaign mode, and then there is a separate arcade mode, which I totally forgot about until right now. But there is a separate arcade mode. That arcade mode is effectively a no continue kind of experience. You go through the entire game, you play through the 8 to 12 levels or whatever through the main story. You have no continues, you cannot die, and you have to beat the entire thing in one sitting. You do that because you want to challenge yourself, really, and you want to try to get on the high score leaderboard. But honestly, it's just a different way of playing the game that's separate from the story. There is no story included in the arcade mode. It's just one level after another. And actually, it's a good change of pace. It's a refreshing change of pace. And I'm just kicking myself for not remembering that it actually existed before I got to this bullet point in my notes. Means I should have reviewed things a little bit closer. Anyway, I'm going to put my own faults aside. I'm going to move on to the next game mode, which is the Infinite mode. This is one of the unlockable modes in the game. If you unlock Infinite mode, that means you can progress down a corridor with literally infinitely spawning enemies, and your goal is to get as many kills in a row as possible. This mode is fun for exactly 2 playthroughs, maybe, or 2 play sessions, I should say, until you unlock the achievement associated with killing a certain number of enemies in a row. After that, I cannot imagine why you would continue to play Infinite mode for any degree of time because it gets very repetitive very quickly. There's also a boss rush mode, which is also unlockable. Boss rush mode is exactly what it sounds like. You will progress through a number of different bosses. You have no continues. You have to protect your overall hit points. You do get replenished hit points as you go throughout the experience. Not every boss gets you extra hit points, but you do get it with some. You will go through the boss rush mode, and assuming that you can survive the whole way, you will once again earn yourself a place on the leaderboard. Now, boss rush mode and infinite mode are 2 of the game modes where you actually can select which character you progress through. You can pick between either Sarah Connor or John Connor for the boss rush mode. In infinite mode, you also can choose you can choose the Terminator. And the Terminator, the cool thing about him is that he has a specific gun. He has the minigun, that chain gun that he has from the film in that one sequence. He has that in infinite mode, which is kind of cool. He also has that in one of the alternate story branch levels that you can potentially play through if you pick one of the alternate branches in story mode, which once again is pretty darn cool. Beyond Boss Rush, you also have Mother of the Future mode, which is another unlockable mode that focuses solely on Sarah Connor. Every single level you play in that mode will feature Sarah Connor, and there are some exclusive levels within that mode that Sarah Connor actually has to progress through in order to beat the game. That's another one where, if I'm remembering correctly, there were no continues, and I think you have to progress through pretty much every single level in the game playing as Sarah Connor in order to beat that mode. But it is a really cool addition to the game, and as we're going through all these different features, these different modes that are included, you might start to see why somebody would play through the game multiple times, because it's not just about playing through the story mode one time and being done with it. You have to play through the story mode at least 3 times in order to see all of the different paths. You have to play through the arcade mode in order to experience the game without any sort of continues and with all action and no story. You have to play through the boss rush mode in order to try to beat all the bosses without taking enough damage to die. You have to play through the Mother of the Future mode in order to just play as Sarah Connor and try to beat every single level in the game. There is a ton of replayability here, and the interesting thing is that replaying the game never gets old, and that's not even to talk about the difficulty settings that we'll talk about in a minute. There is so much here that will make you want to replay the game over and over and over again, and I mentioned earlier that the Sega CD version of Terminator was one of those examples of a game from my youth that I played over and over and over again because I just liked playing the game. Terminator 2D No Fate is another one of those experiences. And like I said, I haven't been really doing that. I hadn't really been doing much of that from a modern perspective. This game made me replay it over and over again, and for the most part, it never got tedious. There is one aspect that did, and I'll explain that in a little bit. But for the most part, the entire experience stayed very fresh the entire way through and stayed engaging every time I played it. Before we move on to the difficulties, though, I do want to mention there is one other game mode, which is a level trainer. The level trainer is exactly what the name implies. You get to pick a level if you've reached that level in a given difficulty. So you have to reach a level in a given difficulty in order for it to be unlocked for the trainer mode. And the trainer mode just basically lets you go through that level the way you would normally go through that level, and it gives you the ability to get better at that level the more you repeat it. I didn't really use this mode much other than to do some achievement hunting, but I am glad that it's there because it does give players the opportunity to hone their skills in a less direct kind of way and makes it so that you don't have to play through 10 levels to get to maybe the 11th level that's really giving you challenge. You can train in the level trainer, and then hopefully by the time you get up to that 11th level, just as an example, in your next story mode playthrough, you're able to get past it much more easily. Easy, though, in this concept is really going to be dependent on the difficulty settings that you pick, because there are 4 difficulty settings in the game. The easiest one is called Easy Money, which is pretty darn easy. I will admit that easy mode is going to be something that's truly accessible to pretty much anybody. I did play through easy mode at least once because I had to do that to get an achievement for beating the game on easy, but that is not the most engaging experience in the game by far. No Problemo, which is the normal default difficulty, is much more engaging and is where I would recommend that most gamers begin their experience with Terminator 2D No Fate. No Problemo is a good mix of challenge with the need to start learning levels. Once you get through, or once you start experiencing the levels and getting used to the overall experience and controls in the game, you're going to have no problem with No Problemo difficulty. It's going to become very simple, so much so that you'll probably be able to breeze through that without using any continues within a few playthroughs. So No Problemo, though, is a good trainer for later difficulty levels like Hasta La Vista, which is the hard mode in the game, or I guess I would say that's the hard mode in the game. Enemies are faster. There are more enemies. I guess some enemies might take a little bit more damage. That's not really something they use here, though. They don't really do bullet sponge kind of things with the enemies as difficulties increase, which I appreciated. It's really about the speed of enemies, the amount that they react to you, the number of enemies in some instances, as well as the number of environmental hazards that you might have to experience. Hasta La Vista mode is pretty darn challenging, but you will eventually be able to beat that one. And if you eventually play the game enough and you unlock enough content, you will eventually unlock Judgment Day, which is the very hard mode included in the game. I believe you unlock Judgment Day by beating Mother of the Future mode, the mode where you're focused on just Sarah Connor playing through all the missions in the game. If you do that, you unlock Judgment Day. Judgment Day is hard. That is a hard mode. And that is something where you will spend a lot of time playing that mode in order to get proficient enough to eventually beat the game. You start with no difficulties, no continues. You start with no continues, though you can earn continues in every single level as you play the game, assuming you know where they're hidden. So you can build up a stable of continues, but the issue is you've got to survive long enough to find them, and you've got to survive long enough to not use them all up by the time you get to the end of the game. This is the mode that I probably spent the most time playing, simply because I would get to a certain stage, I'd mess something up, and then I'd have to go back and replay that whole playthrough over and over and over again. I did eventually emerge victorious from Judgment Day mode. It was insanely engaging. It remained fun the whole way through. It did get a little frustrating at times, as most very hard modes in games can get, but there was enough here to keep my attention throughout the entire experience. Now, the overall game, if you just talk about playing Terminator 2D, if I said go play Terminator 2D and try to beat it, the overall game campaign, regardless of what mode you pick, is around 30 to 45 minutes, which you might assume wouldn't be worth $30, which is the cost of the game. But the simple fact is that this is a game that's designed to be played over and over again. I've alluded to this fact already. There's a ton of unlockable content here. There are different difficulties, and you can pick different difficulty settings by each individual game mode, which means you could play Mother of the Future mode on Judgment Day difficulty. You could play the story mode on No Problemo difficulty. You could play the arcade mode on Hasta La Vista. You have options for picking and choosing the game mode as well as the difficulty for each of those modes. And you get ranked by mode and difficulty for every single thing that you do. There's a ton of unlockable content here. There are 4 different difficulties. When you multiply it all together, it creates the kind of experience that you will want to play over and over and over again just to see what else you can unlock and how good you can possibly become at the game. There's also achievements included in the game, which I've mentioned in the past, at least today. My modern perspective on achievements is that a lot of times when I sit down to play a game, I will try to 100% the game wherever possible, unless some of those achievements require an extensive amount of playing or a ton of random chance, or it just simply feels like it's going to be too much effort for too little gain. I mentioned in a prior episode about Hollow Knight Silksong and a couple of achievements there that I did not pursue around Steel Soul mode and speedrunning the game. I just didn't feel like I wanted to devote the effort to really try to tackle those achievements. I did 100% complete Terminator 2D No Fate because I thought that the gameplay was infinitely replayable, and every time I played the game, I had a ton of fun doing it. It was not tedious at all, except for chasing down one singular achievement, which I thought was designed very poorly. One of the achievements in the game is focused on collecting every single extra continue that's embedded in the various levels that you'll experience as you play the game. And you might think, okay, once you discover where they are, you just have to stay alive long enough to find them, and then off you go, you get the achievement. Only, here's the issue. You can only hold 9 continues at a time, and there are more than 9 continues included in the game. So what ends up happening is if you get proficient enough with the game that you're not using continues, and you have 9 continues banked, when you get that 10th continue, it will actually show up as a Terminator skull, which will give you extra points, but will not contribute to your continue meter, which I thought, fine, the game has got to be designed so that it knows that you picked up the pseudo continue, and that should contribute to your achievement. Only it does not. You have to collect the actual continue icon in every single stage in order to unlock this achievement. I did not recognize that fact, and it took me multiple playthroughs of playing through the game the way I would normally play through it, which was as well as I possibly could, before I realized that in order to earn this achievement, I actually had to kill myself in order to be able to continue to collect continues in subsequent stages, which I thought was poorly designed. I should not have to play more poorly in order to unlock an achievement associated with gathering something in the game, at least from my perspective. Anyway, eventually I did get the platinum and complete all of the trophies in the game, and for the most part I had an amazing time doing it. Like I was talking about, the only bit of tedium was trying to finish that one continue achievement, which took some time that felt a bit unnecessary, simply because of the way that achievement was designed. But otherwise, the act of playing and replaying Terminator 2D No Fate multiple times, getting a little bit better each time until finally I could complete the hardest difficulty in the game without really breaking a sweat, felt amazing. And we're going to talk more about how amazing the game feels to play and experience in just a couple minutes. First though, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, which does not exist for this game, so we are actually going to look at the Steam write-up because this is a true modern title. And the write-up from Steam for Terminator 2D No Fate says, experience the events of Terminator 2 Judgment Day, brought to life through glorious pixel artwork and action-packed arcade gameplay. Play as Sarah Connor and the T-800 through a variety of thrilling missions as they take on the T-1000 and try to put a stop to Skynet's plans before the human race is annihilated. Lead the Resistance as John Connor in the future, fighting on the front lines as mankind's only hope in the war against the machines. In this unique story blending iconic scenes from Terminator 2 Judgment Day with original scenarios and multiple endings, humanity's fate is yours to decide. And then there are some features that are on there on the write-up which say, step into a classic arcade experience that pays homage to the Terminator 2 Judgment Day universe with authentic arcade gameplay, music, and pixel-perfect visuals built from the ground up. An untold future, an iconic past. Relive the film's greatest action sequences and forge new paths as Sarah, John, and the T-800 in a narrative featuring a mix of classic Terminator 2 Judgment Day scenes and untold Terminator stories. Machines of Destruction deployed for battle. Battle against the full force of Cyberdyne and Skynet's arsenal, with multiple enemy types and adrenaline-pumping boss fights to take on. Shoot, sneak, and escape the T-1000's blades in a wide array of levels, and lead the Resistance as John Connor in critical future war missions. Rise through the Resistance ranks. Aim for the highest rank in each level to reign supreme on the high score table and achieve arcade immortality. A legendary score refitted for war. Enjoy a cinematic soundtrack featuring recrafted music from the legendary Terminator 2 Judgment Day score and all new compositions. And finally, fight Skynet your own way. Mix things up with multiple different game modes to unlock and choose from. Story mode, arcade mode, infinite mode, boss rush, mother of the future, and level training. That is the Steam write-up for Terminator 2D No Fate, and I've got to say, yep, this one sells me entirely, especially if you look at the screenshots and the gameplay videos that are posted. That is one of the reasons why I bought the game immediately when it came out earlier in December. It looked phenomenal, it sounded phenomenal, it was the kind of experience I had always wanted from a Terminator 2 game, and of course I did sit down to play it over the course of a couple weeks back around the holidays, and we're going to talk more specifically about different aspects of that experience right now, as we start by talking about the graphics, which featured stellar 16-bit visuals, absolutely top-notch animation, cutscene graphics that were ripped right out of a 90s arcade machine, absolutely perfect from a visual experience. And that perfection goes all the way into the sound and music, which is all excellent. It used songs from the T2 movie alongside original compositions that sound amazing in their own right. The sound effects were perfect. I have no complaints at all about the sound and music or the graphics in the game. And not to be outdone, the narrative and story completely follows the T2 story from the films with some additional content thrown in for good measure. I loved the story in this game. I'm not going to repeat the whole story because it's effectively the same as Terminator 2 Judgment Day, where same kind of setup as the original Terminator, except now the machines are sending back a Terminator from the future in order to kill John Connor as a child. And of course, John Connor in the future needs to send back somebody to protect John Connor in the past, who ends up being the original Terminator from the original Terminator film, or at least the same model, the T-800, played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, which was kind of a little bit of a twist back when the film originally came out, and a twist that I simply loved. I loved the movie. I loved the narrative of T2 Judgment Day. I loved the narrative in T2D No Fate. I especially loved some of the alternative storylines, which, while not super deep, were very appreciated. There were cutscenes that played after each mission. There were some short text blurbs before each mission. The story is pretty much perfect for this kind of game, and I have no complaints at all. Moving on to the gameplay and controls, the controls here are very simple. On the PlayStation 5, which is the system that I played the game on, you use X to jump, square to shoot, circle to take cover, triangle to either melee or throw grenades, depending on the level that you're in, and you move around with your D-pad, or your analog stick, but honestly, as a 16-bit title, I was only going to use the D-pad, because it just feels right for this kind of game. You can also slide along the ground, you can duck, you can climb, you can do pretty much anything you would expect from a traditional 2D platforming side-scrolling action experience. And I've got to say, the controls here are perfect. They're extremely tight, and the gameplay, especially the act and the feel of shooting and meleeing enemies, is extremely satisfying. Boss fights, however, can become tricky, especially at harder difficulty levels, where sometimes the overall mechanics increase, the speed of the bosses increases, there might be some additional enemies and different things that get thrown in to make things a little bit more challenging. You can eventually overcome them, but that is definitely a more challenging experience depending on which difficulty setting that you choose. The bosses can also be a bit of a bullet sponge, though honestly nothing too crazy here. The game overall features the same kind of addictive gameplay in any of those kinds of experiences that make you want to play the game over and over again, just to try to get better and learn each stage just a bit more as you continue to play through each of the different difficulties and modes that the game has. And I've got to say, this game never got old. Until I had to replay the same exact thing multiple times in the hopes of figuring out what the developers intended for that continue achievement that we talked about earlier. I truly believe that this is one aspect of the game that could have been designed better. But it is also a very nitpicky thing to complain about, and it is literally my only complaint about the game. Otherwise, Terminator 2D No Fate is pretty much a perfect action platforming experience, and one that I think everyone should play. So what is our verdict on Terminator 2D No Fate? Well, while this may be a new game, it is in actuality a new old game. So I feel comfortable passing a verdict on it as though it were from the 16-bit era of gaming. And let me tell you, Terminator 2D No Fate is legitimately an instant classic. It monopolized hours of my time over my recent holiday break to a degree that I had never anticipated. And the more I played the game, the more I fell in love with it. I know it's only around a month old, but I still feel compelled to declare affirmatively that Terminator 2D No Fate is absolutely deserving of its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming, and is perhaps even more deserving of this recognition than other modern, albeit retro-styled titles, simply because this is a game that will eventually actually be playable on 16-bit hardware. While we won't know what that looks like until Bitmap Bureau actually completes that port, I have extreme faith in the team, because Terminator 2D, as it stands right now, is simply fantastic, and is therefore a surefire addition to our pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on Terminator 2D No Fate. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com. We have our Discord server, and of course there is always Patreon. Feel free to reach out in any way you like. I will be there, and I will also be there in a couple weeks with our next episode focused on something. We're going to figure out what that something is before we get to that episode. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. And sometimes the games of today are truly instant classics. Goodbye, everyone.